My name is Jim O'Donnell. I'm a professor of marine sciences at the University of Connecticut, and I'm executive director of the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, which is known as CIRCA.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Jim. Could you tell me a little bit about Circa and how it started and what its goal here is?
Yeah, sure. So CIRCA started about 12 years ago now, after Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Irene did some damage to the shoreline. The legislators in Connecticut thought it would be wise for the state to be better prepared for severe weather and also for the effects of climate change. And so they required UConn, the University of Connecticut, and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or DEEP, to collaborate to provide advice. And I've been the leader of that organization since then. And it's grown a lot. And The first charge was really to try and help towns plan for what the effects of sea level rise would be, because coastal flooding seemed to be getting worse in the perception of people around here and in the capital. And so I think that's how I got drafted into the position. I'd been working on circulation and mixing and water level fluctuations in Long Island Sound for a while.
Yeah. Um, we yeah. So can you tell how long did you start working on those aspects in Long Island Sound? How long have you been
Oh,
focusing on this area?
yeah. So I came to UConn in 87, I think it was. And I started working on sort of more fundamental science things initially. How water gets dispersed in the coastal ocean, how fresh water from rivers disperses in the coastal ocean is a very significant thing for determining transport of nutrients and pollutants and things. So I've been working on fluid mechanics for that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but
Nice.
then it sort of broadened into making observations that are support the decision making about where to site what water treatment plants and outfalls and things like that.
Is there over the years that you've been focusing on this area and involved in suggestions and decision making on placement of plants, as you just mentioned, and other things, what sort of, I guess, changes have you witnessed over the course of those years in terms of the way things are done in the Sound, the trajectory of the aspects that you pay attention to?
Oh yeah, it's warmer. The water's deeper.
Yeah.
That's that's unambiguous. Like we can measurements show it pretty
Yeah.
clearly, and the water quality is better, much better than it was um, in most places in Long Island Sound than it was 40 years ago.
Yeah. Is that how my I lived in Hartford, started paying attention to the Connecticut River, in the last dozen years or so. I grew up in Connecticut, but really was not as aware of any of the water stuff in Connecticut as I, in retrospect, wish I had been. What's sort of the timeline, like prior to the 40 years? Like I'm familiar with some of the, the cleanup efforts that have happened over the course of, the last 40, 50 years. Like what was the timeline, as you're aware, prior, in terms of what sort of turnaround has happened with the more recent efforts? Is it like, mid 1800s, or, industrialization
Oh no,
cleanup is kind of what's happening that we've been dealing with?
yeah, I think the Clean Water Act uh, is passed probably like I can't swear to this, but
76, I can
I guess
remember.
it's late 70s.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and yeah, it's around then, and that and then that took a long time to have an effect because infrastructure for collecting sewage and
Hmm.
treating it is huge and costly, and modifying it to be more effective at reducing contaminants and nutrients
Hmm.
uh, took a while. So
Yeah.
billions and billions of dollars to upgrade water treatment plants and separate stormwater management,
Mm-hmm.
water collection systems from sewage systems in
Yeah.
cities.
Yep.
Those are costly, and because a lot of disruption, and it took decades for that to happen.
Yeah.
But now I think 40 years later, it's visible.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. Um, what are how have we'll just talk about Save the Sound for a little while, but how have your efforts overlapped with Save the Sound over the years?
Well, we'll say the sound. I first became aware of about 20 years ago when I was been working on a project that's it's not really sponsored, I guess. The So that in Long Island Sound in the western part, the deep water gets hypoxic in the summer,
Mm.
and that it's been true since the late 70s, and that's bad news for fish and organisms that need oxygen at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
So the EPA, uh, Connecticut, New York, and New York City entered into a consent agreement which requires water treatment plants to be upgraded in a particular way to reduce the nitrogen discharges. And Save the Sound were involved in the organization that helps the city and the states and the agencies collaborate on that. And they've been an advocacy group for additional funding to do the upgrades and also to monitor the effects. And so my work had been funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to make measurements in a sustained way. So we operate equipment that's in the ocean permanently. And so we get funded by the same kind of route for this work. And I came across them at that time, and they're very effective at both informing the public and informing the leadership and the political leadership of the state and the federal government.
Yeah. What can you tell me a little bit about that project that you just mentioned, or the research that you were doing with the you know maintained measurements in the ocean equipment?
Yeah, sure. So like if you invest billions of dollars in upgrading water treatment plants to reduce nitrogen, you want to make sure that it's working, right?
Yeah.
And so as part of that monitoring initiative, which was started, in the probably late 70s, and it kind of geared up as technology improved over the early 80s. But by probably by 87, 88, there was a fairly good uh, program of ship surveys. So once every 2 weeks in the summer and once every month in the winter, Connecticut DEP surveys with a ship where oxygen is low. They make maps,
Mm-hmm.
and so my work complements that. We maintain three buoys that float at the surface of the water, and they're chained to the bottom with big weights. And
Mm-hmm.
on the buoy and on the wire that connects to the chain are instruments that measure dissolved oxygen. And then at the surface, the buoys measure wind and wave heights and temperature and a bunch of other things. And then
Cool.
they telemeter data back here. So the measurements the ship surveys make and the measurements that we make. So we make measurements every 15 minutes at 3 locations, and they
Wow.
make measurements at like 40 locations twice a week. Sorry, every
Yeah.
2 weeks.
Good. Yep.
And so there's a kind of complementary ways to describe what happens.
Yeah.
So then that data is analyzed to try and detect whether or not the extent and the duration of the area of the water at the bottom that's hypoxic has shrunk. And but years change.
Yeah.
Summers are cold and some are warm, and it rains more some years than other years. So it takes a while to detect the effect of those changes. But now it's pretty unambiguous that the area of hypoxia has shrunk by 75%, roughly in line with what we
Wow.
planned, when the program was designed 40 years ago. So sort of a major success story for the EPA and the states, and Save the Sound.
That's
Been
fantastic.
involved in
Yeah.
supporting complementing this program for its duration.
Yeah, how cool. What is something I don't know, like what are some of the things that come to mind to you that are notable, noteworthy about the Sound after studying it for all the years that you have been, that, you know,
Hmm.
is worth that would be worth knowing for folks if they don't already?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess it's there's a lot that I've learned. Like I knew nothing really about. I don't come from the United States. Obviously I grew up in Scotland, and I read a little bit about Connecticut, through books and things like that. But I didn't know much about it. But Long Island Sound is one of the most earliest colonized areas, and the but it's consequently the shoreline's been modified and engineered extensively for the last
Mm.
200 years. So there's very little of the shoreline in Connecticut and the north side of Long Island Sound that is in a natural state. And even the rivers that bring water to Long Island Sound, there are two big sources: the Connecticut River, and it's been modified radically by farming and development patterns. And then the other one's the Hudson. The Hudson brings water to Long Island Sound through the East River, and the East River was uh, radically modified by the Corps of Engineers in the end of the 19th century by blasting and dredging to make the channel narrower, deeper and narrower, and safer for transportation. And that consequently modified the salinity and the circulation. So, learning about that was really fascinating. um, but in terms of its geography, it's the location it's at. The latitude is about 40 north, so it's thought of as mid latitude. But it's isolated from the ocean largely by Long Island, and the connections through the East River and through the eastern end, called the Race, restrict the connection between the ocean. So in the winter, when it gets cold here, the water temperature drops down to almost zero throughout Long Island Sound.
Oh,
And
wow.
it varies between like 0 and 4 in the winter, like in January, February, March is when it's minimum.
Wow.
And whereas the ocean water is warmer, and
Yeah.
so the eastern part of Long Island is actually a little warmer than the western part in the winter. And understanding, that temperature pattern, has been sort of interesting from a theoretical perspective. And then in the summer, the opposite happens because the ocean is deep and big, right? It doesn't warm up as quickly or as much as the shallower water of Long Island Sound.
Yeah.
And the connections, because they're narrow, restrict exchange. And so Long Island Sound warms up a lot more. So in the summer, it can get to 27, 28 centigrade throughout Long Island Sound at the surface. Yeah, so I've written papers about how that happens and how mixing is is controlled and what it does, etc. So as a laboratory for studying oceanography, it's been a uh, nice place to work.
Yeah, I bet. How cool! I didn't really. I mean, that makes total sense, but that's not something that I realized. Um, is there before we get too deep into the conversation, is there anything that you thought coming into it that you might want to talk about or mention while we speak? And should we make
Um,
some space for bringing that up right now?
yeah, well, the effects of climate change, I think,
Yeah,
are I think I'd like people to know more about.
I would like them to know more too. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's so I've been sort of working. There's uh, little political action on that area that's been reinvigorated in the last month or so.
Hmm. Yeah. So tell me. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
But yeah,
Yeah.
well, I think I said it in the introduction. I think the changes have
Yeah.
happened. It's warmer and its water is deeper, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Long Island Sound is, although the water the connection, the exchange of water between Long Island Sound and the ocean is sort of limited by the geometry of the connections. The water level in Long Island Sound is controlled by the ocean, and it's almost the same, in Long Island Sound as it is just south of Long Island. And then if you now it varies daily with the tide, and it varies with storms, etc. And there can be changes between the east and the west for a day. But if you average the water level for a year in Long Island Sound, it's the same as it is just off Montauk on, on the ocean coast. And so the fact that the ocean has been warming as a consequence of climate change, that is, emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, causes the air and the water to warm. The water expands. So when you warm water, it gets deeper, and that's how a thermometer works. If you see a little red line and the thermometer goes up when it's warm, that's because the water is expanding as the temperature increases, and the ocean does that too. So as it gets warmer, it gets deeper, and then there's been melting of the land ice in Antarctica and in Greenland and in glaciers, and that puts more water in the ocean. And so those effects cause sea level to increase, and roughly since I got here, it's gone up maybe like 25 centimeters.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's not inconsequential.
No, it's not a big, it's not a lot in the sense that the tidal range in the western part of Long Island Sound, that is a daily variation in water level. It could be as much as 2-3 meters, right? So,
right.
But
still,
the thing it does, and this is like the thing that people don't quite get, is that when the water level, the mean water level goes up, that is the annual average goes up, then it doesn't take as much for a storm to cause some flooding, right? So the same storm, if it occurred 40 years ago, would cause less flooding than it would if it occurred now, right?
Yeah.
And the statistics of it are another thing I've been working on. And you can show, for example, in New London, if you added like 20 inches of mean water level, then things that would cause flooding once every 10 years, 50 years ago, would cause flooding once every year.
Right.
Now, right? So that risk is just higher. Yeah. So it's not like there's much being permanently flooded, because the mean water level hasn't changed too much. It's just that things that get flooded sometimes are going to get flooded more frequently. Right?
Yeah.
So that's like an interesting thing that I didn't quite understand. It's very important because it drives insurance rates and the value of coastal property. So that's one sort of interesting thing. And the other one is, and there's been some dispute recently about whether or not the projections for sea level rise that were made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 2021 are the best we can do. And the Department of Energy wrote a report for EPA recently that disputed it. And so I worked in the last few weeks on trying to analyze what they did, and they're just wrong, right?
The disputed case, like that was just recently made, was wrong.
Yeah. The IP. So and it's a strange kind of it's an unusual science process, right? The IPC is a very formal process where people are selected and they're nominated by countries, and they participate in this process where they review lots of science and they compare model results, and then it's reviewed interminably, and then it's published, and there's a comment period, and then they finally right. So that process went on. And the report came out in 2021, and so then I and my team here at UConn, I got access to their results, and we analyzed what they had done for the entire globe, and we kind of focused our attention on what happens in Long Island Sound and what can we learn from what they said about Long Island Sound, and we compared what they developed with observations that we made here in Long Island Sound, and they looked pretty consistent. And then this report from the DOE was like 5 guys, or five
Yeah.
people, and they spent about 4 weeks, and they published this thing and they say that it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
And then there's another paper came out recently from two people in Holland with a similar kind of conclusion. But so I spent quite a lot of time recently investigating those two uh, reports, and I think they're just wrong.
Yeah. How do you see those reports in the disputed case there? Like, what danger do you see from that
Oh,
being introduced into the, its potential role in regulation, the conversation, understanding? What danger do you see coming from that?
yeah, so I'm not an expert on that, right? Like, the why people think things is something that puzzles me, right? But but it's clear that, I mean, I do understand that the consequences of sea level rise can be expensive. So so and it's not unnatural to for people to question whether or not the expensive things have to actually be undertaken.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just expense, there's social dislocation, right? If
Yeah. Right.
people's family have lived in this area and if their house has been passed down through generations, and it's going to get flooded more frequently. It's going to cost more to insure, and it may get that more damaged by storms. Then it's a serious issue to them. It's not just an academically interesting thing.
Yeah.
And then mayors and towns, they want to get reelected and they want to do things that people need, and there are multiple competing priorities for the resources they have available. There are schools and social services,
Mhm.
but there's infrastructure like water treatment plants and drains and seawalls, etc. that are expensive, and so making there's lots of reasons to question these results, because if you take them seriously and you acknowledge that the risk of flooding is increasing, then you may want to take action that is going to cost money and dislocate people. And so
Yeah.
that's a difficult thing.
Yeah.
And undercutting this sort of science consensus in this way, with uh, not too much thought, can make it difficult for people to make hard decisions. It's hard already, and this
Yeah.
just makes it more difficult because there's sort of an excuse for not doing it.
Yeah. Um, that's yeah, such a complicated
Yeah,
visual.
that part of it is the complicated part.
Yeah.
Like making the measurements, and then doing statistics to analyze whether or not this effect is significant or not. All that kind of stuff. It is it is we know how to do that. At least,
Yeah.
those of us who stayed in graduate school for 4 years, we know how to do that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
But then there's this other part, which is what do you do about it?
Yeah.
And that's the complicated part, and who should pay what fraction of the cost? I mean, should people who emit CO2 pay a share,
Mhm.
or should the people who burnt the CO2 in their cars and their heating systems, should they pay a share, or should it just be the people who should have known that their property is likely to be more vulnerable in the future because of sea level rise? Should they accept the consequences of decisions? I mean, these are complicated uh, political and economic questions that people could differ on and do.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there anything that, and you might wind up repeating some things that you've already said. Is there anything that comes to your mind that you wish more people in Connecticut knew about the way climate is affecting us and will more?
Uh, yeah, well, two things. Yeah, one is what we've done already, the emissions that we've already uh, caused. We being like the global human community, but mostly those of us in the developed West. What we've already done has caused changes that are going to continue for the next 50 years at least. Even if we stopped emitting CO2 now, there would be sea level rise would continue and warming would continue for probably 40, 50 years.
Mm.
And if we don't stop, or at least begin to ramp it down in the next decade or so, then the changes to the water temperature, the air temperature, the weather patterns will be even more substantial. And so that's sort of like the so we've already committed. That's the main point, right? Um, and there are it's difficult to make measurements to demonstrate uh, what is happening. So cutting funding for measurements just make it even more difficult, right? One of the reasons we are so confident about water level changes in Long Island Sound is that there's been a water level gauge at New London for nearly 100 years.
Mm.
Right? And wasn't because anybody's interested in climate change, but it's because it's a navigation aid. And
Uh-huh.
big ships need to know how deep the water is and when high tide and low tide are going to be, right? So these water level gauges all around the world were developed for that purpose. And they are useful for detecting the effects of warming on sea level and how it's different in different parts of the world. But that's not what it's for. But we don't have observations for long periods of precipitation, for example. So
Mm.
there's only 4 or 5 places around Connecticut where the records of precipitation are reliable and continuous and more than 50 years long.
Wow.
So knowing what it was quantitatively, knowing what it was like 100 years ago is difficult. And so there's proxies we can look at, we can make inferences from,
Mm-hmm.
but that just makes the uncertainties bigger.
Yeah.
So that's all we have. We can't go, and so that's one thing you can't do later, right? Is make measurements. So once the time's passed, that opportunity's gone. And so I really think it's critical that we sustain observations. That river flow, precipitation, wind and weather, wind and rain, water levels, water movement. Those things are expensive. They're not sexy science, but they're critical. And I wish people would appreciate that as much as I do.
Yeah. I wish they would too. Um, what's something you talked a little bit about it? What is something that you have come to appreciate about Connecticut since moving here back when you came to Yukon that you didn't know then or just appreciate now?
Yeah. Well, the geomorphology of New England and Connecticut in particular is very similar to that of Scotland where I grew up. In fact, this picture behind me, that's Scotland, right?
I thought it might be. It's like,
Right.
that's not the Connecticut shoreline.
Yeah, the mountains used to be are the same kind of geological structures as the mountains of New England, and they were glaciated and all that. So that's very similar, and the difference is more social and political.
Yeah.
And I had no idea what that was like, when I came to the United States. I was pretty young, and then when I came to Connecticut, I found it interesting, and this and it's relevant to climate change adaptation because in Connecticut, I think because of the history of the colonization, every little town thinks it's a kingdom of its own, right?
Yeah.
Uh, uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, and
Yeah.
in the UK, and that's not really the case. The national government has much greater influence and power in towns on what they do. That like schools are
Yeah.
funded nationally. The much of the infrastructure for water treatment and drinking
Mm.
water and power, all these things are sort of national scale things. Whereas in Connecticut, there's like 5 fire departments in Groton,
Yes.
and 3 different zoning boards, and yeah. So
Yeah.
this is a political difference that's sort of noticeable, and it's got the implication is it makes things hard to get done,
It does.
right? Like if
Yeah.
there's no statewide, or it's very difficult to enact statewide standards for stuff.
And if
And
you have to convince 169 towns to individually decide to,
yeah,
take on paying for things, yeah.
yeah. And in some towns, the whole town has to vote on a bond issue,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a meeting and people hold their hand up. Yeah, we're going to build a school.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like so which is it's got pluses and minuses,
Hmm.
right? It makes Connecticut it's of an intrinsically conservative place
Yeah.
because of the it's difficult to make change. Um, so that's
Mm.
like a noticeable thing, and for adaptation, places which are vulnerable then um, are are not getting as much attention, I think, as they should.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more at all, or
Well,
yeah.
there are many cases, many cases around the state where, um, where problems are shared. So like I-95 and the railway run east-west, and the rivers run north-south,
Yeah.
and many of the cities are built in the flat areas near the shoreline. And so every city along the shoreline has got underpasses that go underneath I-95 and the railway.
Yeah.
And during high rain events, many of them flood.
Mm.
And so each town now is trying to figure out what to do about their crossing, right? So, and each of them has to deal separately with Amtrak or DOT,
Mm. Oh my
and
gosh.
but that problem is generic,
Yeah.
So that's an example where, and to some extent, it's appropriate because in some towns they may decide that we can live with the flooding. Other ones, they'll reroute traffic around the flooding, and others might close it or build a bridge or something. So each
Hmm.
decision could be different, but that problem is a consequence of the geography and the development patterns, and it's 30 towns all face it,
Yeah. Wow.
dealing with it separately.
Right.
So that's sort of an interesting thing, and then there's the shoreline coastal access,
Hmm.
right? And that's the sort of difference thing between the UK and Connecticut. That in Scotland, anyway, the trespass laws are radically different. Like in Britain, uh, you can cross private property as long as
Yeah.
you don't do any damage and you don't, you know, annoy people and things largely. And so in Scotland, there's this idea that there's a right to roam in the hills,
Yeah.
and whereas in Connecticut, trespass laws are really pretty vigorously enforced, especially along the shoreline.
Yeah.
And so that access to by the public to Long Island Sound is very limited.
Yeah.
And where but what is shared is this tradition that I think comes from Magna Carta, that the king in those days, right? He owned the land subject to the ebb and flow of the tide,
Yeah.
and that was part of the charter of Connecticut.
Ah.
So the state is now the custodian of what's called littoral rights. So that anything below mean
Yeah.
high water is open to the public for
Yep.
fishing and walking wherever you want. But getting there is
Right.
is restricted by the property abutting the land.
Yeah.
And so even towns and parks, there are just very, very few places where people can actually go from land into the ocean.
Yeah.
That's different in the
Yeah.
UK. And
Very.
in California too, apparently there's much more public access to the ocean.
Mm. Gotcha.
I think
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
that is a consequence, I think, because maybe your experience not thinking about the river and the sound so much when you're growing up is a consequence of the fact that it's
Yeah.
very difficult for people from Hartford to come down here and figure out how to get to the beach.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct. Yep. Absolutely correct. Jim, thank you so much. Is there anything I am still, there's still plenty that I would love to ask, but we are running out of time. Is there anything that we haven't yet spoken about that you want to make sure is a part of this conversation?
Uh, one thing I think is important is uh, not to overlook the commitment that UConn has made to this. right? You know, I think
Yeah.
I sort of take it for granted until this year, where our budgets are getting assailed.
Oh gosh.
But the university maintains the marine sciences program at UConn for the last probably 50 years, and it
Yeah.
started at Noank and now is at Avery Point in Groton, and it requires, you know, money and to pay people and buy equipment and sustain laboratories
Yeah.
and it's not just me that's working there, right? There's like 20
I know.
faculty, and we study a broad range of things, including, you know, shellfish and
Yeah.
geochemistry, you know. So there's a lot going on that is underlies our ability to protect and exploit the resources of the shoreline areas of Connecticut. And I think that's kind of overlooked sometimes.
I,
Again, it's not a Hartford thing, you know.
no, exactly. It's like yeah, like people think of UConn, they think of what's happening in stores, like
Yeah.
occasionally, you know. But
Oh,
I've known about Avery Point, but it's definitely not part of the regular conversation
yeah,
of
yeah.
the
And you,
appreciation of what's
so in
going
the
on.
summer, sometimes you see like in the weather channels, you know, they show water temperatures on Long Island Sound, and they show what the wave height is going to be and what the wind is over the sound, and that information comes from UConn.
That's awesome.
We own the equipment. People that work for UConn go out and maintain it when it breaks, you know, and it's just, and I think it's maybe we should have branded it more effectively so that when it gets on TV, it says UConn, you know.
Maybe
But
it's not too late.
yeah, well, maybe we should do that. Husky weather.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate your time, and I'm
Okay.
grateful to have been able to speak with you for this.
Well, and I'm off to work now. Today is a meeting of the Long Island Sound
Yeah.
Study Advisory Committee at Avery Point, and I'm sure the Safe Sound people will be there too.
Well, please tell them that I say hello if you see them.
Okay, well, bye bye.
Take care, Jim. Bye bye.